also bad.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
Perhaps it's better today.
hope so.
So, let me ask you again, and please pronounce it slowly so that I can get it. What is the name of the province or the area that you live in China? I
Uh,
looked it up on the map.
it's uh this city is called Hefei. Hefei. You can look for Shanghai. Then it's near Shanghai, about 200 kilometers from Shanghai.
Oh, this map is not, at least until I go into it. Uh, okay. I see Chong Going. That looks like a center. Are you anywhere near that?
Sorry,
Uh,
can you see the name again? Chen
Chong,
Chong
Chonging, Chong Going, or
Chongqing.
Chonging.
Uh, oh,
Okay.
no. It should be maybe 5 You usually look to the right, to the east.
Okay. Go to the east of that.
Yeah, maybe about 600 kilometer east of
Oh.
Chongqing. Can
Um,
can you
you
find
know,
the
one of
Shanghai?
one of the things that I find so much problems with is that the Chinese use the English letters of the alphabet completely differently than we do in the U.S. They like
Yeah,
all of the ones that we don't like, all the letters, lots of Z's and X's and things like that.
yeah.
Uh,
Actually, it's called the pinyin in China. In Chinese,
okay, I see a Zhanggie. Is that it?
Zhang
Yeah, Zhanggie.
No. Uh, you can look to the east coast of China. Then you'll find Shanghai.
All right. I tell you what, possibly the best thing to do with this is you send me find it on Google and get Google spelling and then send that to me on Skype and then I'll Google that word that you sent me and I'll be able to find it. But we can do that anytime. I was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
really curious because I don't know that much about China. Um, so where did you learn English? Because your English is quite good.
I learned English from school because in China we learned English from the third year of elementary school. Keep studying English until college.
Well, I have experienced students who have gone through the same process in India, and they wind up not speaking English. They speak an Indian English. The dialect is so strong, but your dialect is good enough that I can actually understand you. So congratulations, your English is pretty good.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So last time that we talked, we gave a basic introduction that included all of the kinds of things that we had talked before. Today, I would like it, if you don't mind, to actually speak within the framework of Anapanasati. And then later, we will see how Anapanasati fits in with um, and through the basically the four foundations of mindfulness, and that we practice Anapanasati and the four foundations of mindfulness for the fulfillment of the seven factors of enlightenment. Now, for many years, I was confused about that because I was assuming that we would practice Anapanasati and the Satipatthana for the fulfillment of the Four Noble Truths. because I find that in many other places. And so it looked like a contradiction to me until I finally figured out, no, the 7 factors of enlightenment are in fact most of, all, if not all of, the Eightfold Noble Path. But the Eightfold Noble Path is from a different perspective in the sense of that which needs to be done. But the hallmark of the the 7 factors of enlightenment, the Sambhojana, is the word unremitting. Now, what we mean by unremitting is not that it's there all the time, but that it comes back on a frequent basis. And that the first item on the list, no surprise at all, is sati. And so you'll find sati all over the place. Anapanasati, the Satipatthana. And now the 7 factors of enlightenment start with an unremitting mindfulness, which means an unremitting return to the object. The second of the factors of enlightenment is unremitting investigation. Well, now this word unremitting investigation is in fact mentioned in a sutta called the Great 40, sutta number 117, is in fact one's noble right view. One's noble right view is the investigation of states, the power of the investigation of the states. And so the enlightenment factor then is directly associated with noble right view under the sense of the investigation. Now, this whole idea of investigation is very, very important. It's very powerful. And that I break sati and the investigation or mindfulness out. When we use the terms that you have heard like mindfulness actually, or awareness, is trying to combine these two things in a unified practice. And so they talk about awareness. But I want to make sure that you understand that there is a division between the two. And that what sati actually is the ability to remember. And that's all it is. So if the mind has wandered away and you recognize that the mind has wandered away from the breath, that recognition is in fact sati, because you remembered that your original intention was to watch the breath. But now that intention to watch the breath is also coming out of right noble view. So in fact, from the very beginning of practice, one is practicing the Eightfold Noble Path and is practicing going in the direction of the factors of enlightenment. And when these factors get to the point of unremitting, then they become enlightenment factors, because you can keep doing it over and over and over again. Now, one of the examples I use is the example of a drum. So imagine that my hand here is the head of a drum, and that my fist here is the mallet or the stick that you're going to beat it with, all right? And so think about what the purpose of a drum is. Is this the right way to play a drum?
No.
No. Is this the right way to play a drum?
Yes.
Yes, okay. That's the kind of sati that we want to develop. The kind of sati that comes back, and it comes back when it's needed. And it comes back forcefully. Okay? This is an important quality that when they teach mindfulness, they don't talk about. Mindfulness, in fact, is not a very good word in English language, because as I ask the students, even of native English, have you ever heard of the word mindfulness before you heard about Buddhism and meditation? And say, no. Nobody ever heard of the word mindfulness, so is that word too is not really part of our vocabulary. What I do remember out of the English language is the quality of things like mind what you're doing, and an expression would be mind your P's and Q's, because you know on the letter Q and the letter P are just backwards of each other, and little children learning the alphabet will sometimes confuse them. And so we talk about mind your P's and Q's, which basically means to pay attention, right? Well, this pay attention is not what we mean by sati. What we mean by sati is the quality or the ability to remember. And so anapanasati then means to remember anapana. Well, ana is in breath and prana is out breath. That these words anapana, actually, there's even a style of yoga that's called pranayama yoga, and that's exactly what they're talking about. The words are backwards, and there's an R in there someplace, but they're talking about the same thing. So in breath and out breath, anapana sati, to remember the breath. Now here's an interesting point, and that is that the first two steps of anapanasati use the verb of understanding. Understanding the breath, in the sense of all you need to do is know when an in-breath is an in-breath, and know that it's a long breath or a short breath, or know that it's an out-breath. So there's basically just two things by two things, a four-way matrix. And that's all we need to remember or keep track of at the first stages. After that, the rest of anapanasati is that he trains himself. It's a training. It's a skill development. The word in Pali is bhavana. You probably heard that word before. If you know about Bhante Gunaratana, he's at the Bhavana Society in West Virginia. And that's what that word means. It means develop or train or build up a skill, which means that in the beginning we're not going to be able to do that very well. In fact, anapanasati, for the first couple of stages, is just so dead easy to do it, and everybody can do it. But after 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, the mind wanders away and they forget to do it. And so now we have to remember to come back. And so that's what I want to do with you is to offer you the first skill that needs to be developed. And as you progress, in fact, you've already been developing this skill with the classes that you've taken so far, without quite understanding it. And so now that you're getting what I'm talking about of the understanding of sati, you'll see how important it is. And so you'll start to pay attention to, this is a skill that I want to develop. Also, whenever you find that skill in development, you want to congratulate yourself, to be pleased with it, that you're actually successful when you do remember. And a clear example of that is the mind wanders away, and there it goes, and it's off and it's gone, and nothing has changed, and more time has passed, and the mind has probably wandered into something that really feels bad. Oh, I don't want to think about that. And now mindfulness comes. When the mindfulness comes, or when sati arises, what happens with the students is they're already in a state of bad feeling. And so when they recognize that the mind has wandered away from the breath, they say, oh no, monkey mind, oh, this is so terrible. Well, actually what happened was there was no real change. They were already feeling bad. And so they didn't change that. And so this wasn't really strong sati. It wasn't useful. That was enough for them to remember that the mind has wandered away, but they haven't really come back to the breath yet, or if they do, they come back kind of grudgingly. But when you recognize the power of sati, then you'll become able to congratulate yourself when it arises. That I can really feel it now. The mind comes back. It comes back. That's the skill that we need to develop. Because without that skill of remembering, then paying attention or investigation or look at what's going on or all of those words that fit into the next category can't be done because we didn't have the sati to begin with. So when sati comes back, we want it to come roaring back with a power, with an energy. And that energy that is going to come back with will be that which is considered to be right noble effort. Now, when it becomes unremitting, the word changes from effort into energy. So that the third step of the 7 factors of enlightenment is unremitting energy, a boundless energy. Now, we can see that energy many different places in a natural state. One of the examples is a brand new tender infant. If that tender infant's foot or hand reaches and touches a red hot coal, that tender infant's hand will withdraw immediately. The infant doesn't have to think about it. Oh, do I really want to move my hand or not? No, the hand is moved before the mind even knows it. All right? So that's the kind of thing that when we start to develop sati, it's not like a sati that is handed off. It's handed off, in fact, with a force, a power that eventually becomes an energy. So this is what we mean by noble right effort. Not noble right effort, though, is an effort that most students fall into. And that's an effort of working too hard that's based upon wanting something. And what is it that most of the meditation students want? They want enlightenment. And so they work really hard, giving themselves sometimes headaches, sometimes all the way to a psychiatrist. I've seen that happen. All right, so what's the difference between working too hard and one's right noble effort that becomes an actual energy? That's the question. The answer is that when the effort is not correct, it causes suffering. That in fact, wanting to be enlightened is suffering. Wanting things you don't have is on the list that the Buddha has of things that cause suffering. The big ones are naturally old age, sickness, and death. It can be expressed as lamentation, grief, despair, crying. But on a mental state, the first item that he notes was wanting things that we don't have. So that's a big, big point of suffering. So in your practice in a way that you don't want anything. One way of talking about that is like practicing like you're the eye of the storm. Things are circling around you, but you're steady. You're not caught in the whirlwind. Another one, which is kind of silly, but it's got a beautiful drawing over at Wat Suan Mok, and that is sit like the tongue of a poisonous snake. Because why? Because the poisonous snake is dangerous to everything except his own tongue. The snake is very careful not to bite his own tongue. So we want to learn to sit like we were the tongue of the serpent, the tongue of the poisonous snake, because we're not no suffering there. All right. So how can we work then to go in this direction? Well, when the mind wanders away and we don't know it, it will normally wander into some sort of pain or suffering or whatever, certainly into the past or into the future, wanting things, whatnot. And then sati comes, and we remember that, oh, my job was sitting here was to watch the breath. This is a point in time when you really have to generate mentally a joy, a gladdening, in Anapanasati is actually what they call step 10. But that doesn't mean you have to wait until then, but it is a training that you have to put the mind into. That when you recognize that the mind has wandered away from the breath, that you have to gladden the mind. That's the first thing that you want to do. And you can do that with the quality of success. Aha, I get you. I see you. There that mind was, it had been wandering away already. So that I recognize that it was wandering away. Why should I feel bad now when something really wonderful, marvelous, and good has just happened? And that is sati has come on the spot. Because before it was wandering away and I didn't even know it. Poor me, poor victim. But now when the sati comes, now I can be in charge. Okay, success. And so I feel that success. I can gladden the mind. And then we can start back into Anapanasati and do it correctly. So there's a lot built into what I've just said. And a lot of it has to do then about attitude. Well, attitude is also one of the 4 items on the Eightfold Noble Path. And so already you're seeing, just to be able to practice Anapanasati, you actually have to practice the Eightfold Noble Path. Because if you don't practice the Eightfold Noble Path while you're practicing Anapanasati, you won't like it very much. You won't get anything out of it. You may go for a while because you still really want to become enlightened, but eventually you'll quit because it's not working. But if you change the style from wanting to become enlightened into being really joyful that you could see the mind wandering away, that in itself is a kind of enlightenment. Because we're waking up and changing our way of looking at things, changing our way of doing it. So already now we have these 4 steps of the Eightfold Noble Path, and we also are beginning to work on them as the 7 factors of enlightenment. What is that? Sati. The next one is right view. The right view comes first as a foundation. The right view doesn't come up until the sati comes. And when the sati comes, there's right view. Oh, I was going to watch my breath. And then the next one is the effort that it takes. If your sati is correct and your view is correct, then joyfully you will take the right effort to merely come back to the breath. Not slapping yourself around, oh, you bad boy, you're supposed to be enlightened already. Why are you not watching your breath? Okay? That's the wrong behavior or the wrong effort, is wanting something and working too hard at it. The right way is to enjoy the moment. Say, aha, I caught you. And now we can come back to the breath easily, joyfully, and happily. Now, I'm going to give you a secret. I have just taught you everything you need for the whole rest of your path. And any time you come with a question, the answer will be in the frame of that which I've just given. All right, here's an example. When someone gets angry, well, we already know through our various cultures, Asian culture has a no-no on you're not supposed to display anger in public. That already says, okay, well, if I can get rid of anger in my own mind, then that's better. So already we have right view about anger. And so when we see it come up, we can say, oh, there you are again. That anger, I can see you. Ha ha, I can see anger. Let me take a deep breath and come back out of it. And we recognize, oh, the very same technique that we started with on just when the mind wanders away with hindrance, that becomes the entire practice. Why? Because as we practice and become diligent, sati becomes an enormously valuable tool. Right view becomes a very valuable tool. Right effort becomes an enormous valuable tool, and right attitude is actually not just a tool, but it is the result also in the sense of satisfaction, full of joy. So I have a few words that I use: contentment, safety, security, joyfulness. These are skills to be developed, but the way that we develop those skills is with that joyful attitude, aha, I can see you. Because that joyful, aha, I can see you is based in satisfaction. It's based in also in success. Just a second ago, the mind had wandered away and I didn't know, but now I can see it. That's success. And so we want to start capitalizing on these very small successes, these very small satisfactions, and they will pile up. Find contentment. And we'll talk about contentment later. But find some contentment in this moment, and it'll start to build up. You start to feel secure and safe. And so these are actually powers that are to be developed as kind of secondary powers. They're not actually factors of enlightenment, but one of the factors of enlightenment, one of the later ones, is relaxed, rested, peaceful, not being disturbed by anything. So at ease. This is one of the enlightenment factors. Now, how can that be an enlightenment factor? We think that that should be easy, but it's not. People really don't know how to relax. They think I can relax with sports, or I can relax with buying an expensive car, or I can relax by buying a house. No, this is all greed-oriented. No, relaxation really only comes with satisfaction. Once we're completely satisfied, then we can relax. And in the Pali is translated into tranquility, but that's a really highfalutin word. A much better word to use is just relax. Take it easy. Because that ease is built on success. All right, so now that we're talking about the Four Noble Truths and the 7 factors of enlightenment and how they fit into the practice of Anapanasati, we can recognize then that throughout the practice of Anapanasati, there are various objects that we're going to take as meditation objects. That at some time or another, we're no longer going to be taking strictly the body as an object of meditation, but we're still going to be watching the breath, and we'll start to watch the mind. In fact, here's something very interesting. At that point of sati, when you recognize that the mind has wandered away and that the mind is filled with hindrances, that's actually step 9 of Anapanasati, which is to experience the mind. You just experience the mind. In this case, we experience the mind as hindrance and no hindrance. Later, we'll begin to watch the mind in a different way so that we can see, is the mind tired? Is the mind fit for work? Is the mind curious? Is the mind lethargic? Is it bright? Is it noble? These are the various qualities or the distinctions of the mind that are actually separate from the mental objects. They're related, but they're separate. In other words, you can have a bright and shining mind and have one thought, and you can have that same thought when the mind is dull, but the next thought after that will probably be different. Because when the mind is sharp, we can see things a whole lot better. So, this is one of the qualities of learning to understand the mind. If we look at the framework that we're talking about the Satipatthana, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness based in body, feeling, mind, and mind objects. So in the beginning, we start working with mind objects in the sense of the hindrance there or not. And we also are working with the breath. Eventually, we include with the mind, and then the last one to work on is the feelings. And the reason for that is because the feelings are often very subtle. And so we deal with them a little later. And that I have a lot of techniques and things that we can use that can bring that entire Satipatthana together. So, in the fact of the four foundations of mindfulness, each of those has anapanasati with 4 steps. So that there's 4 steps for the body, 4 steps for feeling, 4 steps for the mind, and 4 steps for the mind's objects. Now, eventually what's going to happen, or pretty soon what's going to happen, is that we're no longer going to allow hindrances to be the mental objects. That we're going to take out old, unhappy, and unproductive, and let us say, unwholesome thoughts. And we're going to start putting in thoughts that are valuable, wholesome, useful. But if you think about it, we're already beginning to do that just when we come to that point of when the mind wanders away. Oh, I caught you. I caught you. That's in fact throwing those hindrances out. While I'm saying, oh, I caught you hindrances, the hindrances have already gone. The thought that I'm having now is a thought of joy. Oh, I caught you. That's how easy it is for you to change the mind. And so the part of the intention then from the path with noble right view is to be able to change the mind like this, to be able to gladden it, to be able to know the mind. And when you have the skills to do that, you'll begin to see. Now, in fact, these 4 foundations of mindfulness, the body is directly related to the feelings. The feelings are directly related to the mind. The body and the mind are kind of indirectly related through the feelings. But both of these are 2-lane highways in the sense of traffic going in both directions at the same time, so that the feelings will condition the mind and the mind will condition the feelings. And in fact, we're already using, aha, I caught you, as a way of changing the mind and gladdening the mind. That will in fact change the way that we feel, so that we begin to have more positive feelings that are not based upon greed. Oh, I want to be enlightened. In fact, we can have that feeling of joy. Oh, I like it right now. So we begin to condition the feelings that way also. But eventually we learn to see that the feelings are actually a conditioner for the mind. Now, we're going to learn that on a subtle level, but on a very strong level, we can see that at some universities they have a debate team. Do you know what I mean by debates?
Yeah, I understand.
Where they're formal, okay. They generally frown on people having what they call ad hominem attacks. In other words, I'm not supposed to attack my opponent directly. Here's the reason for that. Is that if you can get your opponent angry, you can get him confused. People who are angry do not play the game, whatever game they're playing. It's a sport game with the body or the mind game. Play chess, play poker, whatever it is. If you can get under the skin of your opponent so that you can get him irritated and frustrated, he will think more and more about his irritation and frustration and less about the game he's playing or his ability to debate. This has been known for a long time. If you can get people angry, they just simply stop thinking. They become confused. Well, if that's the case, then you can see for sure feelings condition the mind. If you can get somebody angry, his mind just stops working, at least to the level that he needs to be in this kind of competition that we're talking about. So, on a more subtle level, if you don't like, condition your mind to where you get your mind in a state of saying no to something, that if you liked it, you would say yes. That's another simple, easy way of how our feelings condition our mind. But if you come to understand how you feel and what way you feel, and you can do it very early, then we can change the way that we feel. This is all about seeing, by the way. This is all about direct knowledge. This is not about any kind of real work to do to drop defilements. All we need to do is to see them clearly, and they will kind of break up. For instance, you can see that the mind has wandered away, and the hindrances break up immediately. Aha, I caught you. The same thing is true about feelings. Once we see how we feel, then we can choose how we're going to respond. If we don't see how we feel, then the feelings will give us a mental state that will cause us to go into suffering. And I'll give you the details on how that works. But just right at the level of the Satipatthana, you can see how that operates. That feelings condition the mind, and the mind conditions the feelings. By understanding that, later we can see exactly how that works. And we'll go into that eventually. But right now, what I want you to understand is that actually what I've been doing is I've been talking about step number 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are the steps of Anapanasati that are dealing with feeling. But before I do that, I want to make sure that you understand that when I use the word step, I'm not talking about a sequence of events of one step after another, or a grade like some child has to do first grade and then they do second grade and then they do third grade. That these things, in fact, these four aspects of feeling within Anapanasati are to be seen individually and to be developed individually, but not necessarily in any particular order. In fact, it could be said this way, that for all of the 16 steps of Anapanasati, each one of them, according to the Satipatthana, can be brought into two groups. That is, the first two and the second two. So that right from the get-go, right from the very beginning of the student's practice, he will do step 1 and 2 for body, step 1 and 2 for feeling, step 1 and 2 for mind, and step 1 and 2 for mind objects. And later, as he progresses in his practice, that's when we'll begin to add step 3 and 4 for the body, 3 and 4 for feelings, 3 and 4 for the mind, and 3 and 4 for the mind's objects. So in the regard to feelings, that would be step 5 and 6 are to be developed fairly quickly, and then 7 and 8 are to be developed later. And 7 and 8 are those parts that show how the mind is conditioned by feelings. Now, in the mind's part, we have step 9, which you know right away, because you have to know, does the mind wander away or not? So we know what state the mind is in. That's step 9. Gladdening the mind is step 10. Step 11 and 12 are a little bit more difficult. They take a little longer. And those are, number 1 is to concentrate the mind, and I'll tell you about what concentration means. But it has a lot to do with that unremitting quality that we were talking about earlier. And then the next one is to liberate the mind, when the mind is actually free from all suffering. It may not be permanently free, but right now, let's give it a break. This is good. So this is the way that we look at Anapanasati is that it's not a monolith, that it's got a lot of nuance in it, and that it's a kind of a practice that gives guidance, that it has this step and that step so that we can progress through it. And as we're progressing through, we're also going through deeper layers of the mind so that we can get down to the basic layer. And the basic layers of the mind is down at the instinctual level, the bare instinct of the self-preservation instinct. You probably heard about that. Have you ever heard the phrase self-preservation instinct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. When it operates correctly, it keeps us alive and happy. When it's operating the way that we normally use it, which is without wisdom, it is the biggest source of all of our trouble. That self-preservation instinct manifests itself as mana or conceit. And that conceit is stated as I am. And then we finish that sentence based upon feelings and mental states in the sense of I am marvelous, I am superior, I am good enough, I am a failure. But in all cases, that I am is the leading cause of what's going on. And so as we progress through the Dhamma, we move down through layers of ignorance of the mind, down through the feelings, and then we get down to these basic things that is called underlying tendencies. And these underlying tendencies are also called the four modes of clinging. Four modes of clinging. What that means is, wow, there's only four. I thought that I had to stop clinging to everything. No, there's only four, but it's a big four. That in fact there are things that are worth clinging to. One of the things that's worth clinging to is, for instance, this present moment, as opposed to not clinging to the past and the future, but cling to now, be here now. Another one would be to cling to the path, cling to the Eightfold Path, or to cling to sati, to cling to right view. These things are worth clinging to adhering to, because we know them to be useful through our own experience, through your own wisdom. And we already know that you have some of that because look at all the retreats you've already been doing. So you know that there's something in there. You know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Eightfold Noble Path is worth following. That's an important milestone, by the way, because before that, there's a lot of doubt. But when we come to the point of recognizing that there really is no other way, I recognize now that the real issue in life is suffering and no suffering. When people are confused, they think that the real issue of life is what's the meaning of life? Is there a God or not? What's the Big Bang? I mean, we can get really confused on the things that are really important and worth knowing. But the deepest knowledge that we know is suffering and no suffering. And so my job is to see suffering for what it is so that I can stand just an inch out of the way and let it sling by. Don't have to move much. Don't have to work very hard. I can see its trajectory. I know right where it's going. So this is actually the goal. Then the goal is to be able to see suffering as it arises so that we can stand quickly out of the way of it. Well, that goes back immediately, right back to that very first thing. As soon as you see the mind has wandered away, when sati arises, so now whenever suffering comes, sati arises, we see it, we can step out of the way. So there's one little teaching of, never mind, start again. There's one little teaching of, when the mind wanders away, start again. Aha, I caught you. That little teaching is really all the teaching that you need, if you can remember to do that every time. But there's also a huge structure behind it, and that whole huge structure is the entire teaching of the Buddha, but it can be wrapped in a very small little package. And that small little package is the Four Noble Truths. And that we practice Anapanasati for the fulfillment of these Four Noble Truths. And basically the way that it works, and I'll tell you about this next time in detail, is that we practice Anapanasati merely to get the mind cleaned out and make it fit for work. Cleaned out in the sense of cleaning the hindrances out and getting all of the superfluous stuff out of the way so that we've got an ability to focus. And then we start focusing on that which is really worthwhile focusing on, and that's the Four Noble Truths. And what is the first Noble Truth? Suffering. What's my first experience of suffering? I want something that I don't have. That's suffering. Wanting something that you don't have. And so if you can see that one, then you'll be able to see a lot of them. So be careful when you begin to want something from your meditation, because if you want something from it, then you're suffering. But if you're enjoying your meditation, just like it is right now, that's progress. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just said to make the mind ready for work, and then so the mind can see the Four Noble Truths, right?
Yes.
But if, for example, you went into the first jhana, then the hindrances are temporarily suspended, then you will know there will no suffering. So it's a bit like a paradox for me.
Well, actually, the way that it's described in the suttas is that when the mind is actually secluded and free from suffering, that there is joy and pleasure in that seclusion. Just get rid of the stuff.
Yeah.
And that's pleasure. And in fact, by recognizing that, throwing that stuff out, seeing that stuff as suffering and throwing it out, that's actually practicing the Eightfold Noble Path, or that's putting the Eightfold Noble Path right into operation. And it's done through the seeing of suffering and no suffering. When you can see that hindrances are suffering, then we can clear them out.
Okay, I see.
Okay. So it's actually quite easy. You can come out of suffering very, very quickly, but then you go back into it very quickly. So we need to develop the skills of keep coming out and coming out and coming out and coming out. And the more we do that, then the suffering gets weaker and weaker because we're not spending any time doing that anymore. So the sharper our sati, the sooner we come out of suffering, then the more time that we're spending in good, wholesome thoughts and good, wholesome behavior. And so the neurons that are that were manufactured and built simply to support the old bad habits, some of those neurons are going to start to die out through lack of use and through old age and not get replaced because the new neurons that we're replacing. So eventually, slowly, by unremitting mindfulness, come back, never mind, come back, never mind, come back. And there's also a major time when we come to recognize that no matter how obstructed the mind is, we can come back. We can always keep coming back. And that's the first knowledge, in fact. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll tell you all about that next time.
Okay.
But I will repeat that again. And that is the very first knowledge is the knowledge that we can clean out the hindrances, that we can do that. And you know that. You already have that knowledge. You've done it, 1,000 times already. in all of those retreats that you've done. You were able to get that stuff out of the mind. Eventually, you'll begin to trust that you can do that every time. No matter how obstructed the mind is, you can clean it out. And then that's real success. This is really a noble position of knowing that you can get rid of hindrances no matter how obstructed they are. Even the hindrance that keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, I know exactly what to do with it. When I catch him, I'm throwing him back out again. And we gain skill. That's our skill, the skill of throwing out the hindrances, of catching them, noticing them, recognizing the distinction between what's a wholesome and what's an unwholesome thought. And we start having only wholesome thoughts, and when we catch unwholesome thoughts creeping in, we throw them out. We bring in new wholesome thoughts. What's the first wholesome thought that we bring in? Aha, I caught you, Mr. Unwholesome Thought. You get out of here. No unwholesome thoughts allowed this minute. And so this is the way that we practice Anapanasati through the various stages of it. We're always looking at that we've got the breath. There is our anchor. So if the mind has wandered away from the breath, the first thing that we do with gladdening the mind is we reestablish the breath. And that will ground us into the body, which will also ground us into the here now. That's one of the reasons why we practice with the breath, is because, number one, we've always got it with us. We don't have to set up any equipment. We don't have to take a laptop out of its case and turn it on and wait for it to power up and boot up and get ready to use. The breath is right there, Johnny, on the spot, every time, always available. The next point is that the breath is a grounding technique that grounds us into the body, into the reality of the moment. That you cannot, in fact, become mindful of the breathing without also becoming mindful of the body and a little bit mindful of your environment. But when we're lost into a particular track of thought, and my example of this is computer programming. I've got a lot of coders who are students, some of them with PhDs. And we all recognize this one thing, and that is that we can get so focused on the code that we're not paying attention to anything around us. We're lost in that code. But that code is better to get lost in than reminiscing about the past or the future. But it's still too narrow a focus. That's not the kind of concentration that we want to develop. We want to develop the kind of concentration that is available here now all the time. This is an example of that would be martial arts, in the sense that the coder who is overly deeply focused, like a meditation student who is overly deeply focused, that his enemy can come in, or maybe it's not an enemy, maybe it's his Zen master, maybe he's coming in with a stick. If the Zen master comes in and the student does not show some small twitch or movement of the body to show the Zen master that he knows that the Zen master is there. In other words, if he's lost in thought, he's the one who's going to get hit with that Zen stick. It's because he's not paying attention. But if I know the Zen master is behind me, I'm going to sit up just a tiny little bit. I know he's there. Okay? So that's a different kind of concentration than being lost in code or lost into some deep jhana. So that now we can look at three different situations. One is the mind is just scattered all over the place. Past, future, anywhere. The normal mind of normal people. Capable, by the way, of being sold anything. That's why we have big business. It's because they can sell their stuff. So that's the normal mind. The second kind of mind that is really focused and concentrating on something to the point of leaving out other things. And that's the kind of concentration that the Buddha practiced first. This is the kind of concentration that many students think is part of the Buddhist meditation. But then there's this third kind of concentration, which is very open. It's the kind of concentration to where it's unlikely for anyone to sneak up on you because you're aware of their presence before they come to you. But if you're lost in thought, they can sneak up on you. If you're lost in a deep concentration, they can sneak up on you. But if you're alert and awake and aware, mindful, watching what's going on, they can't sneak up on you. So does that give you an idea about the kind of concentration that we're looking for?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Kind of concentration where nobody can sneak up on you. You don't go deep, you go broad. It's a shallow, not a deep meditation. How shallow? Shallow enough to cover the whole ocean.
It seems there's an interesting way to test the right concentration you described. That's startle response. If I lost in thought, but I think I'm doing meditation or I'm become aware of present. Then if there's a loud sound, sometimes I'll have startle response. Then I know that I'm not really concentrated on the present moment.
Okay. Help me by telling me one more time so that I can make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you just described the three kinds of concentration, right?
Right.
In my experience of meditation, sometimes I think I'm in the present moment, but then came a loud sound like the slam of the door. Then sometimes I'll just be startled. Then I know I'm a bit lost in the thoughts or other thing.
Actually, that's another indication that people who are mindful and in the moment do not have the startle reaction.
Yeah.
That something happens and yeah, it happened. But if we're lost in thought and the startle comes in, what was that?
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways of looking at it. Yes, that startle reaction or other things like that show that in fact that we're not totally right here in the moment. But if we're in the moment, that means that our awareness is for and open to any and everything that can occur. One of the practices that I have, and it's actually to the point now of being a toy, is that I want to know when anyone comes into the yard, and that it's a fairly complex yard in the sense that 4 houses share the same yard. One house used to have dogs, they don't have anymore, and I've got 2 dogs here, and part of my job is to know what's going on in the yard before the dogs do. That if they perk their ears up, and I don't know why they're perking their ears up, then I'm not doing my job. My job is to be there first, to know first. So if for instance, my wife comes, I know it, and I know it before she's even in voice range. I know it before I hear the motorcycle, and she has to turn a corner. So that corner is only about 50 yards away. When she turns a corner, my job is to know that she's come. So that's the kind of a toy that I use to stay mindful and open all the time. That's actually part of the Zen practice. That's why there's the whole idea of the Zen stick. Is because the Zen teacher can walk up at any moment, and we need to be here now, not lost in thought or lost in project. So this is the new way of looking at it. This is sati. Sati is in that component, which reminds us, or it's the reminder itself, to come out of that lost in thought space and come and be here now. That's the skill that needs to be developed, is sati. And it becomes an enlightenment factor when it becomes unremitting. That does not mean that it's there all the time. But the question is, can it come at the right time? That's the question. Is it going to be unremitting to the point that it's going to come up just when you need it? Because we've been practicing it as a skill. So this is the way that we look at Anapanasati, through this understanding of the the four foundations of mindfulness, of the body, the feelings, the mind, and the mind objects. And with these mind objects, one of the ways that we want to look at these hindrances is that they're temporary and they're fading away, they rot. As soon as we see the thought pattern as a hindrance, it's like stopping it in mid-sentence. Eventually, we'll be able to get to that point. In the beginning, it'll take a while. It takes a little bit. So as sati rises, the thoughts are still there. But as sati begins to get strong, you can see those thoughts and just throw them out. And the thought that we're going to be putting in there is thoughts about meditation, thoughts about the breath, thoughts about being a champion, thoughts about being a lion, thoughts about unremitting mindfulness, thoughts about what is suffering and the nature of suffering. And so these are the right kinds of thoughts to have that we want to think about, rather than letting the mind think about whatever it's in the habit of thinking about. So the Four Noble Truths becomes our meditation object, as it were, because those are the only kind of thoughts that we're going to allow.
I have a question. When you are saying, describing this kind of thoughts about the noble truth, it's different from the ordinary thinking, right? I mean, what I learned from my book on meditation, usually they encourage you to focus on the bare sensation. We're not encourage you to focus, to be lost in this recursive thinking. In the beginning, I even thought those thoughts should not arise.
Well, let's put it this way then. What is it that can be in the mind? One of the things that can be in the mind are the hindrances, or just any old thing that comes in. Another thing that can be in the mind is that which is applied and directed through wisdom. We know what we want to think about, and we are going to think about that. That in fact, for people who are doing mathematics or computer programming or coding, that's exactly what they're doing. They're not letting the mind just wander away. They're applying it to something specific. We can also apply specifically the mind to the Dhamma, which is what I'm recommending. And then the fourth one is to not apply it to anything at all, because it's empty. It has no object. Okay, this is the second, third, and fourth jhana, and that those jhanas have a value to them, but the value is only in the sense of the training of the mind, so that they can, in fact, when you're not sitting in meditation, that you can still see the Four Noble Truths. But there is also a time when you're sitting in practice to where the mind has not come to a state of stillness. The mind is still operating. The question is, are you going to operate it, let it operate the way that it wants to, are you going to require it to apply the mind to a particular meditation object and keep it focused there? So your question then would be these four things. We can either let it go and not apply it to anything, not let it have attention. We can use it as the developed skill, and that developed skill would be like reading a book, or doing mathematics, or doing physics, or doing computer programming, or even playing a musical instrument. This takes a kind of focus, especially when we're learning a piece of music. Or we can take that same kind of focus and put it on the Four Noble Truths, because the mind is focused on something. It isn't empty. It's still active, but we are in charge of the mind so that we can focus it and put it on what we want to put it on. And in this case, it's going to be the Four Noble Truths, but are we going to go deeply into the Four Noble Truths? A lot to say about that topic. Or we can bring it to a complete state of emptiness, which would be like the second jhana or the higher jhanas. Now, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa says that when the mind is in the higher jhanas, that it is not fit for work. Just like when it's rambling around in hindrances, it's also there, not fit for work. That sweet spot is that ability to apply the mind and make it do the work, to look through and to see something, to look for something, to be on guard for something as it comes up, and stand at attention and know that you're standing at attention because you're keeping the mind standing at attention to be on guard with it. All right, now that in a way, there is also a sweet spot that you could say that second jhana can be that way. But the deeper jhanas, no. Once you go, especially if you go to the fourth jhana when you're out of the body, with being out of the body, you can't even be doing anapanasati. The breathing has become so subtle now that the breath is not a good object of meditation anymore. In fact, the body itself is not a good object for meditation. That is all purely mental stuff. Now, the jhanas do go hand in hand, and every system of Buddhism throughout the world does at least acknowledge that these jhanas are there. Some teachers will teach jhana more importantly, but ultimately, being able to do jhana and only jhana, it would be to the point that when you're in jhana, you're good to go. You like it. But when you're out of jhana, then life is hell again. So now it becomes an escape. I want to do jhana so that I can get out of the world. But if you practice with this sweet spot so that you understand the nature of the mind, you're able to apply this ability to think, to apply it, sustain it, see things, understand them directly, then you can bring that same quality or that same set of skills out of your sitting practice into your daily life, so that when you're out there dealing with things and something comes up, just like, oh, I recognize a hindrance. In other words, sati comes. And now I can deal with that anger, or I can deal with that frustration, or I can deal with whatever it was because sati has come at the right time. So that's why there's a distinction in what is called vipassana versus, normally they will use either the word jhana or samadhi or samatha. But samatha versus jhana, that's the question that's been asked for centuries. And the answer is, if you have samatha, go develop vipassana. If you've got really good, solid vipassana, go piddle with jhana. You'll do really good with it because you know what you're doing. And if you don't have either one of them, then develop them both, but the emphasis should be on vipassana, that we only need jhana up to the first jhana, and after that, then we put it to work. So, in fact, there's a sutta, number 36, to where the Buddha says that it's the first jhana is the path to enlightenment. Well, the second jhana is where the mind stops. So the empty mind is in second jhana, but a mind that's fit for work, where you can apply it and keep it sustained on that object. And then the object that we want to apply it to is well defined to be the Four Noble Truths. With that, we can see what we need to see in order to come out of the first three fetters. Then, in fact, the next time you call, we'll get the sutras out so that we can go over this material. I like to go it over and layer it over and over and over again. You're right to ask that question. And that if you're able to come to a state of second jhana where the mind is thoughtless, congratulate yourself for that too. That's a marvelous thing to be able to do. But it's not something to attach to, but more it's a skill development, and now we're going to use those skills for better things than just merely sitting in the bliss of jhana. But that's a long way to go. Normally, students will practice for years before they're able to get to second jhana, though the first jhana is actually quite easy to reach.
I heard you talk in one video that if we are able to read a book, then then that's the first jhana.
That's basically, well, it's like the first jhana. It's missing a couple of components, and one of the components that it's missing is the joy of the seclusion of the hindrances. And normally when we read a book, we don't actually concentrate on how much we love the book. But if you read a book with the joy of, oh wow, I like that, yeah, that's great, oh wow, that's so just, oh I love that, then that would be closer to first jhana, reading the book. The first jhana has a lot of joy, because the joy is actually that which is developed, it's required, and it is the result of the success of having a mind that's free from hindrances. Oh, what a relief it is. Oh, what joy it is. What pleasure it is to be free from all of that junk. And so that's the way of looking at it. This is why jhana is the way I refer to it, it's the sweet spot. It's the place where we come to that we can gain the most benefit from the teaching of the Buddha. And that, in fact, if jhana is our only intention, anapanasati is not the best practice. That, in fact, stargazing or fire gazing or watching flowing water, these things will bring jhana faster than anapanasati. Anapanasati is for vipassana. It will take you into jhana if you know how, but you can go into jhana a whole lot faster by doing another technique. And that these are all well known within the Buddhists. They call them kasina meditations. The blue meditation, which is actually green. And the yellow meditation, which is actually brown. Why? Because when leaves are green, they turn brown. They may turn yellow and then brown, but the translators don't understand that the blue kasina is not blue, it's green, because the Pali language doesn't make a distinction between blue and green. But the blue kasina is actually just a set of leaves that you have stitched together with a thread to make a mandala or a kind of a picture. And then what you do is you stare at that mandala and then close your eyes and see if you can mentally reconstruct it. And then you open your eyes again and take a different part of it, or looking at it in more detail, and then close your eyes. And after a while, you're able to reconstruct that mandala completely, so that you know where all the veins are. All right, that'll take people right into jhana. Anapanasati, not so interesting.
I have read the book, The Mindfulness with Breathing by Buddhadasa. It said, in the first text, that's the body. The third step is about that you imagine something. It's called nimitta or
Nimitta, yes.
yeah. So this seems like the jhana practice.
Okay. Now, when I was just talking to you about the green kasina and saying about closing the eyes and imagining that kasina, that imagination, that's the nimitta. All right, and it's done visually. So these are visual meditations. And so the visual meditations are much easier to bring on a mental image. With anapanasati, it's really difficult to bring on a mental image of the breathing. But it's not designed to take people into jhana. We don't need a nimitta. We don't need that kind of concentration. All right. Now, another thing, in fact, I've got quite a number of students who, one in particular, well, actually two in particular, had really become dedicated to his path, but one of them eventually got over it, and now the second one is getting over it. There is some dangerous places within the teachings of Chuladasa. One of the dangerous places is that he only mentions the Four Noble Truths as kind of an appendix. But he's actually, and is correct, what he's teaching is meditation. But I don't call myself a meditation teacher, I'm a Dhamma teacher. And that we use meditation as a tool for the freeing up of the mind, to where he's using it as a tool to concentrate the mind, and also part of the teachings that he has is a very organized method. Step 1 and step 2 and step 3, and it's talked about in the sense that you really have to get step 1 down before you can do step 2. And you really have to work on and get step 2 completed before you can get step 3. But naturally, none of the students are going to do that. They're going to read the whole book before they ever get to step 1 or step 2 completed. All right? So basically, the book then is actually like a math book. And I've done this with math books. I'm going to take a university course on a new mathematics. So I've got the book now, and I read the first chapter, I get it. I read the second chapter, and I've gotten that one too. I read the third chapter, I'm getting lost. I read the fourth chapter, and I don't have a clue. Why? Because I didn't do any of the examples at the back of the chapters. And because I didn't get a good foundation on it. Okay, so this is almost always what happens with Chuladasa's students, is that they're trying to get Chuladasa out of a book. And Chuladasa himself does not come in book form. And that also the students have told me that when I'm talking about certain things and emphasizing them, and he says, Chuladasa talked about that in the book, and I read that. But it didn't dawn on me the way that you're telling it. Okay, so the very simple things, a lot of the stuff that's in Chuladasa's book, the students haven't practiced well, and so they've glossed over it. And so that's one of the problems with having a book that is organized like that. And so I teach in a much more natural method, and the natural method that I use also allows for the students to have questions and answers as we go through the Dhamma. That's one of the disadvantages of Chuladasa's book, is you cannot ask it a question. Another disadvantage of Chuladasa's book is that it won't kick you in the butt when you're when you're making a mistake. It won't point you, you need to go do this. You need to do that. These kind of qualities are not in the book. This is one of the reasons why we need a teacher. But the more you understand about the way that I'm teaching, though my style is different, Chuladasa and I agree on almost everything, which is not necessarily the case with Daniel Ingram, who is another famous author. In fact, I understand that Daniel and Chuladasa, excuse me.
That's okay.
I have heard that Daniel Ingram went to visit Chuladasa and that they had a number of conversations between each other. And that was just recently, like within the past couple of years. And so my particular position is whatever differences they have, I'll let them deal with it. That's not my problem. I'll let them deal with those kinds of things. I'll kind of stay on the sidelines. But I do want to work with the students who have been getting good stuff from the books. But to make sure that you understand that it's a different perspective or a different way of looking, not that what Chuladasa is teaching is wrong, but that I teach in a way so that I kind of present the whole ball of wax, the whole teaching. We only need one book. And in fact, that one book would be Dhamma by the Natural Method, and every chapter on it has the same title: Dhamma by the Natural Method, Chapter 1, Dhamma by the Natural Method, Chapter 2, Dhamma by the Natural Method, Chapter 3, because it's all kind of mixed together. But the West, like mathematics or whatever, we think that the right way to do it is step by step. We have to climb to this step, and when we get there, we have to make sure that we've got it, and only then can we climb to the next step. And when we've got that one, then we can climb to the next step after that. Well, guess what? Life isn't like that. Life does not care what step of the ladder you're on. It's going to slap you with whatever happens in the moment. And so we have to kind of deal with things at a natural level anyway. And so there's skills to be developed so that some things in the beginning are overwhelming, but other things we can deal with. Later, the things that were overwhelming to deal with now become able to deal with them. And then later we can reminisce, oh, that used to be a big problem for me, but it's not anymore. And eventually we get to the place we're not even thinking about it because we've forgotten all about it. Something that used to really bother me, I don't even think about it anymore. Why? Because we've dealt with it over and over and over again until we finally uprooted the thing. And so this is why we practice Vipassana the way that we do, and we do it with various levels of samatha or various levels of jhana. That we don't have to go all the way through the jhanas before we start Vipassana. That the Buddha even talks about the direct method. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa in Thai language calls it the shortcut method. And the shortcut method, or the direct method, is to do Vipassana and jhana together, but only enough jhana so that Vipassana works correctly. That the intention is to get the Vipassana working, and that we need the jhana, at least up to the first jhana, in order to do the Vipassana. And so we work with them together. Later, after we get extremely good at Vipassana and really understand the mind, now we can go through the jhanas almost like child's play, because we know what we're doing. But if you go through all the jhanas first, it may take 10, 20, 30 years for more for people to get all the way through the jhanas. For even the Buddha, it took him about 6 years. And so the much better way of doing it, do you want to suffer for 6 or 8 or 10 years and then begin to practice correctly and learn Vipassana? Or why not do it all along? Eliminate tons of suffering. So you don't need to do all of the stages of the stuff that's mentioned with Chuladasa. Especially, I think, in fact, that it's step 10 on his path to where he finally recognizes joy. Why not put the joy right from, I mean, we can use that as a lubricant. So there's no reason to do step 1 and then step 2 and then step 3 and then step 4. Let's mix them all together and use whichever one that can be best advantage for the moment. And that's also true, by the way, with the Mahasi's 16 stages of insight. But they don't have to go in order. Just because they were listed in that order doesn't mean the student has to do them in that order. That's why the natural method is so much better, is because we don't know when things are going to happen. So it's better to be in the beginning prepared for everything.
I have a question about the book Mindfulness with Breath by Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. When I read that book, that book lists 16 steps. It feels like it's organized pricing method.
I know, but how in the world can you teach it without having taught, and especially with a group? Because he delivered those lectures to a large group of people, and he delivered them in the same organizational style that the Buddha delivered it originally. However, if you get down to about page 257 or something like that, is where he finally says, this is the first thing that you need to do. And you've already read through all of these other things and practiced this and that and the other thing. And it's only in step 10 where gladdening the mind is mentioned. So Bhikkhu Buddhadasa in the formal descriptions is going to say gladdening the mind is step 10, which is, 2/3 down through the book. But in there he'll say, oh no, you've got to practice this right from the very beginning. That in fact, another way of talking about it is, you cannot come into the meditation room and bring only your body, leaving feelings, mind, and objects outside, and then later bring only feelings. Oh no, when you come into the meditation hall, you've got to bring all of you in there, which means you've got to deal with everything. And so that's why we look at it from the natural place. So yes, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's book is quite organized in its structure, but that is not necessarily the way that it's to be practiced. And he's gotten at least 4 books on Anapanasati. It's a favorite topic of his.
So you mean his book don't represent the natural method?
He presents the natural method in another document.
Okay.
Okay, that's not the right document to read. In fact, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Okay, after we finish with this, I'll look it up and send it to you. He's got an article on both the organized method and the natural method. And when you read these two things together, you'll recognize, oh, well, organized method has its value for large groups of people, but the natural method is the way to teach one-on-one. In a group, you've got to teach in an organized way. And the Anapanasati Sutta, if you read it, you recognize there was a huge crowd. Must have been hundreds and hundreds of people there. And so he's teaching it in an organized way. And what is the organization? Is the 4 foundations of mindfulness. That's the organization. Because we practice anapanasati for the fulfillment of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, you would expect him to lay out anapanasati like you would lay out the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which means you cover body first, and then feelings, and then mind, and then mind's objects. But in practice, we have to deal with the body and the breath, and then we have to deal with the mind, then we have to deal with the mind's objects, and then we have to deal with the mind again to gladden the mind. That's going to seep down into the feelings, and now we come back to the breath. And so it's always like 1, 2, 9, 10, 13, 10, 1, 2 again. And that happens every time the mind wanders away. So, in that regard, I can see why students get very confused about how to practice when the books, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's books, the sutras themselves, Chula Dasa's book, is all laid out in the organized method, but nature doesn't come in an organized way. And so we have to learn to practice a more natural way of doing it.
Yeah, that's also my confusion when I read the book by Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, because because the book said I should practice step 1 first, then step 2, then what confused me is that what should I do with other sensations, like the hindrance or other thing, because when I practice the Mahasi method, it didn't care which sensation. It just focus on the most obvious sensation. If there's no other sensation, then go back to the breath as the main object.
Okay. Now here's an answer to that conundrum that may surprise you. And that is that neither one of these detailed techniques are what they're getting at. That you're too much lost in the details. But the overall idea is for you to come out of suffering. If you understand that that's the overall idea, is to come out of suffering, then that will help you not be confused about the fact that various teachers teach in slightly different ways. That doesn't make one teacher different or better than the other. And in fact, if they sat down together, they would probably come to some agreement and then describe it differently, the two of them agreeing to describe it differently than either one of the books were. So don't get too hooked up on exactly what the books are saying, but rather to understand that there's an overall structure, and that this overall structure that we're talking about is not samadhi-based or jhana-based, but that the overall structure that we're looking for is much closer to actually what the Buddha taught, which is suffering and no suffering, or the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path, how the mind functions, taking that second noble truth. And in fact, the second noble truth is in fact the Satipatthana, breaking the body down and seeing all the sources of suffering is how the mind works. The sources of suffering is because of the way that I feel about my feelings, etc., like that. And then when we break it down a little bit more, we get it down to the aggregates, and that's when we really see what's going on. So that second noble truth is really an important point, because that's a major change, you see. Up until that point, most students are looking for a little bit of magic, or maybe a whole lot of magic. And that the second noble truth is what teaches us that the source of suffering is mentally generated within our own mind. that we create our own suffering. Lobha, moha, dosa is all there is. Now, we as human beings have learned a game from other human beings that we've been playing for thousands of years. It's called the blame game. Oh, it's not my fault I'm suffering. He made me suffer. It's his fault I'm suffering. And if I suffer enough, maybe you'll have mercy upon me and take me out of my suffering. Okay, so what that is that's playing the victim's game. And this is the teaching of the Buddha, is the fact that, oh no, the suffering that you're in, you're making it. And if you want to come out of the suffering, you're going to have to change and clean your own mind out. Because the source of the suffering is mentally generated. So that's the real teaching of the Buddha. But before the Buddha understood that, he was already off into jhana land, because he went to all of the best teachers. And he was dissatisfied with every one of them. Even though they taught him great things and gave him great skills, it did not answer his question. His question was, what is the end of suffering? And the answer to that is not in the jhanas. The jhanas may give some skills that'll be useful, but the jhanas themselves do, at best, can only help us to avoid suffering rather than to eliminate it. But I have been told that Culadasa has either finished or is working on a second book, and that second book is all about the Four Noble Truths. So he sort of wrote the Mind Illuminated, sort of to get out of the way the stuff that the Buddha got out of the way with in the beginning, so that we can get down to the real issue. And that I'm saying, no, let's go after the real issue just as soon as the mind is ready for it, so that we can practice the natural method. You don't have to go all the way through the university and get a PhD in topic A before you start grammar school in topic D. That you can do them together. And doing them together is the natural way. And so we begin to work on the Four Noble Truths right away. Also within the Mahasi method, in his 16 stages of Vipassana, the Four Noble Truths are at step 12. Well, that's probably correct once we finish with the Four Noble Truths. But we don't go all the way up to step 12 before we start dealing with the Four Noble Truths. We would have never gotten to step 4, 5, and 6 if we haven't already been dealing with the Four Noble Truths. That's a better way of looking at it. But only by step 12 do we fully understand the Four Noble Truths. But we need to work with them much earlier to understand the nature of suffering, to understand the way that the mind works, etc., like that. So we'll be talking about that over the course of your time with me. But I want to make sure that we're getting through all of these little questions that you're having, so that you understand that it's actually the same technique, or it's actually the same overall practice, even though some of the techniques sound like they're different. If both of them are doing the same skill building, here's an example. One teacher says, oh, if you want to build up the muscles of your arms, you have to work with dumbbells. Here's a 10 and here's another 10. Lift them together or lift them separately and do it that way. And then you go to another teacher and he says, oh no, if you want to develop the muscles, you've got to do it with barbells. You got to do the really big ones. Okay? The answer is both of them are correct, and eventually you're going to work with both of them, both the barbells and the dumbbells. So you can't say, well, one teacher's better than the other because he used barbells first and the other teacher used dumbbells first. Does that analogy help to understand? Yeah, okay. Good, good, good. Because I don't want you to have to be in a position of listening to me talk, understanding what I'm saying, then you go back and you read Culadasa and you get confused again. Because I'm telling you that we're not really in disagreement with each other than the sequence of events. That his is kind of more of a step-by-step approach, and mine is really approach this is really all over the place. Because that's life. Life is messy. It's all over the place. It doesn't come in grades.
Actually, these days, I'm not practicing according to the book or the mind illuminate. Actually, I'm reading the book by Bhikkhu Dasa, the book Mindfulness with Breathing for Serious Beginners.
Which book?
Uh,
Mindfulness.
with Breathing for Serious Beginners. I think that's the title. Let me
Yes,
check.
yes, that's Santicaro's translation. I remember that it was a series of talks. Basically, what had happened was is that the first book was published incompletely. We've actually kind of lost track of that. There is another book. Let me see if I can locate it really quickly. I'll be right back. Okay. So this is probably the book that you're talking about. Can you see it? Mindfulness with breathing. Is that it? Can you hear me? Oh, I don't hear you. Hello, testing. The microphone is